The sun over Alexandria shimmered like molten gold, painting the marble palaces in a deceptive light of peace. Beneath that beauty, however, the royal halls reeked of tension and whispered death. It was here, in this city of scholars and serpents, that Arsinoe IV came of age, the daughter of a fading dynasty and the sister of a woman who would one day be called divine. History would immortalize Cleopatra, yet it would try to erase Arsinoe, the shadow in her sister's legend. The Ptolemies were no native Egyptians, but descendants of Greek conquerors who ruled with opulence and terror. Their lineage was a tangle of incest, intrigue, and calculated cruelty. Poison was poured as often as wine, and love was merely another form of strategy. The palace where Arsinoe lived was magnificent, its walls carved with gods, its courtyards fragrant with myrrh and jasmine, but behind every curtain lurked fear. Siblings smiled across banquet tables, while daggers gleamed beneath the cloth. Arsinoe learned early that royal blood was both crown and curse. Her father, Ptolemaic IV, spent his life begging Rome for protection, selling Egypt's treasures to keep his throne. The Roman eagle loomed over the Nile long before their armies marched. By the time Arsinoe could read, she understood that her kingdom was already enslaved by debt and deceit. Her mother's face was a memory, her sister's eyes a storm. Cleopatra, older and far more cunning, drew every gaze in the court, the golden child destined to rule. Arsinoe, though younger, possessed a different kind of fire, quiet, observant, and waiting. She saw the cracks in the kingdom's foundation, the way Rome's coins bought loyalty and silenced dissent. And in the still hours of night, when torchlight flickered against the alabaster walls, she heard her father's guards whisper that someday one of his own daughters might be his undoing. Even as a child, Arsinoe understood that survival was an art, and she studied it with the intensity of someone who knew her bloodline devoured its own. She learned rhetoric and mathematics, but her truest education came from watching betrayal play out like theater, one poisoning, one exile, one silent disappearance at a time. In the glittering shadow of Cleopatra, Arsinoe stood unseen yet unbroken. The gods had placed her in a dynasty of monsters and made her their quiet witness. What she did not yet know was that history had already chosen her part, not as a queen remembered, but as a sister erased. And in that silence, her rebellion began. By the time Arsinoe reached her teenage years, the illusion of Egyptian sovereignty had already begun to crumble. The kingdom that once built pyramids for gods now bent its knee to senators in distant Rome. Her father, Ptolemaic IV, known mockingly as the flute player, had bought Rome's protection not with valor but with gold. Gold stripped from temples, from farmers, from the Nile itself. Every coin he sent across the Mediterranean bought another year of false peace and deeper humiliation. Arsinoe remembered him not as a father, but as a desperate man, trembling before Roman envoys who smirked behind polished helmets. When he died in 51 BCE, his debts remained, and his children inherited both his throne and his chains. Cleopatra, then barely 18, was crowned beside her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy III, forced into marriage by the family's own decrees. The coronation glittered with golden diadems and hollow cheers, but the kingdom was already fractured, ruled not by blood, but by fear. Arsinoe stood in the shadows of that ceremony, her eyes sharp and silent. She was the extra, the younger daughter without a throne, the spare piece in a game where spares were often disposed of. Yet she watched, memorizing every whispered threat, every exchange of power between courtiers. She saw Ganymedes, the powerful eunuch who whispered into the boy king's ear, spreading venom against Cleopatra. She saw the council split, the nobles aligning with the child king's faction, the soldiers confused, and the streets of Alexandria simmering with unrest. When Cleopatra was driven into exile, Arsinoe witnessed something new, the beginning of chaos. Crowds rioted, priests screamed about omens, and Rome's shadow grew longer across the harbor. But then a Roman fleet appeared, and from it stepped a man whose name was already legend, Julius Caesar. He claimed he came to mediate the quarrel, but Rome never came without a price. Arsinoe saw how swiftly he fell under Cleopatra's spell. She saw her sister, clever, daring, and merciless, wrap herself in linen and be smuggled into Caesar's quarters beneath the cover of night. By dawn, Egypt's future had been rewritten. The Roman general who conquered Gaul was now conquered by a queen, and as the banners of Rome rose above the palace gates, Arsinoe felt the chill of destiny tighten around her throat. She understood what her sister had done. Cleopatra had not only secured her throne, she had summoned the destroyer of worlds into Egypt. From that moment, Arsinoe's path was no longer her own. It was being written by the empire that devoured nations, and by a sister who would sacrifice anything, even family, to keep her crown. The streets of Alexandria had become a war zone. Smoke choked the skyline where incense once drifted, and the cries of merchants were replaced by the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. Rome had come not as ally but as master, and its arrogance burned hotter than the Egyptian sun. Julius Caesar's legions occupied the royal quarter, their crimson banners fluttering over temples that had stood since the age of the pharaohs. In that chaos, Arsinoe IV made her escape. With her loyal tutor and protector Ganymedes, she slipped through the corridors of the besieged palace, under cover of torchlight and silence. Beyond the marble walls the city raged. The Nile's once peaceful current carried the reflection of flames as the people of Alexandria rose in defiance. They saw in the young princess something pure, something theirs, a true daughter of Egypt uncorrupted by Roman gold or seduction. When Arsinoe reached the Egyptian encampment beyond the city walls, generals and soldiers alike knelt before her. She was barely 20, yet her voice carried the steel of conviction. They hailed her as queen of the resistance, the rightful ruler of Egypt, against both the invader and the sister who had invited him. Under Ganymedes' guidance, Arsinoe transformed the rebellion into a calculated war. Alexandria, the city of scholars and merchants, became a fortress of fire. The twisting alleys turned into killing grounds. From rooftops and hidden courtyards, Egyptian archers struck the occupying legions. They severed supply lines, blocked aqueducts, and cut off Caesar's access to fresh water. What began as a rebellion turned into a siege, one that Rome itself was trapped inside. The great general who had conquered Gaul now found himself cornered by a teenage girl and her strategist. Panic spread through the Roman ranks as supplies dwindled and disease crept through the camps. Caesar was forced to fight not only the enemy beyond the walls, but the fury of the Alexandrian people within them. Desperate and humiliated, he ordered his own ships burned to keep them from falling into Egyptian hands. The fire roared through the harbor, consuming scrolls, warehouses, and lives. Flames leapt skyward, and among them perished part of the great library of Alexandria, mankind's treasury of knowledge. But that night, amid the smoke and blood, Arsinoe stood on the ramparts of the city she defended, the fire reflected in her eyes like a crown of vengeance. For one brief, blinding moment, the girl they had dismissed as a spare princess had brought Julius Caesar, the most feared man on earth, to his knees. Victory, like desert mirages, fades when grasped. Arsinoe IV had stood against the might of Rome and forced Julius Caesar to the brink of defeat. But in Egypt, loyalty was sand, shifting, treacherous, and impossible to hold. Her armies were weary, her alliances fraying. Among her generals, jealousy simmered like venom. They whispered that Ganymedes, her guardian and strategist, wielded too much power, that he ruled not for Egypt, but for himself. Caesar, ever the tactician, saw the crack and drove his dagger of manipulation straight through it. He released young Ptolemy IV, whom he had held captive, sending him back into the Egyptian camp like a poisoned gift. The boy king, barely old enough to command, returned with his own loyalists, and with him came confusion, division, and betrayal. Egypt's army split apart, brother against sister, general against general, all while the Roman legions tightened their grip. As Roman reinforcements arrived from the sea, the fate of Alexandria turned. The city that had once burned in Arsinoe's name now bled under the weight of its own chaos. The soldiers who had hailed her as queen now doubted, fearing the power of Rome more than the promise of freedom. Then came the Battle of the Nile, a clash of gods and mortals. The river, once the giver of life, ran thick with fire and blood. The Egyptian fleet was crushed, ships splintering like broken bones beneath the Roman onslaught. From the shore, Arsinoe watched the water turn red, the cries of her soldiers drowned by the thunder of Roman catapults. Amid the smoke and panic, Ptolemy III, draped in gold armor, attempted to flee across the river. His horse stumbled, his weight pulled him down, and he sank into the Nile's depths. his golden plates glimmering briefly beneath the surface before vanishing forever. The sight was both horrifying and prophetic. Egypt's dynasty had devoured itself. Roman soldiers soon breached the final defenses. Ganymedes was captured, Arsinoe dragged from her tent in chains. Dust clung to her hair, her royal garments torn, but her eyes burned with the same defiant fire that had once terrified Caesar himself. As she was forced before the Roman general, the silence of the battlefield pressed down like a curse. For a fleeting moment, even Caesar hesitated. This was not a queen defeated by greed, but a girl who had fought an empire and nearly won. Yet mercy had no place in Roman politics. Arsinoe's fate would not be decided by her valor. It would be written by Cleopatra's envy and Rome's lust for spectacle. Rome had never seen such splendor, nor such cruelty disguised as celebration. When Julius Caesar returned in triumph in 46 BCE, the Eternal City became a theater of conquest. For 4 days and nights, the Roman people cheered their general as he paraded the spoils of the world: gold from Gaul, jewels from Pontus, ivory from Africa. But the most shocking trophy was not treasure. It was a queen. From the shadows of defeat, Arsinoe IV was brought into the light of humiliation. She was forced to march through the streets of Rome in a spectacle that blurred victory and vengeance. Her royal linen gown shimmered under the sun, yet her wrists and ankles were bound with chains of gold, a mockery of her heritage. Every step on the cobblestone was agony, but she kept her head high, eyes forward, her face calm against the jeering mob. The crowd expected a broken slave. What they saw instead was dignity wrapped in misery. The Roman people, so used to seeing kings and barbarians dragged in disgrace, fell into uneasy silence. A murmur spread through the masses, pity. Even the hardest legionaries felt it. This was no savage enemy, but a girl who had stood against the greatest power on earth and lived. Behind her, a massive tableau rolled forward, a painted scene of the Battle of the Nile, depicting her brother drowning in his golden armor. The image mocked her dynasty's fall, but when Arsinoe passed the effigy, she did not bow her head. She looked upon it with the cold fire of defiance, a silent rebellion that pierced Caesar's triumphal mask. He sat upon his chariot, crowned with laurel, basking in the adoration of Rome. Yet as Arsinoe passed, a flicker of unease crossed his face. For the first time he felt the crowd's loyalty shift, not toward the conqueror but toward the conquered. To execute her would risk turning her into a martyr. To free her would risk rebellion. So Caesar chose a punishment crueler than death: exile in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a sanctuary turned into a golden cage. It was safety that reeked of imprisonment, holiness wrapped in humiliation. And so, under the marble gates of Jupiter's temple, Arsinoe vanished from Rome, still wearing her golden chains. The people whispered her name long after the trumpets fell silent. For though Caesar had paraded her as a symbol of submission, the memory that lingered was not of her chains, but of her unbroken stare, the moment a teenage queen made an empire blush. The winds of the Aegean carried the scent of salt and incense across the marble terraces of Ephesus, a city of light, trade, and prayer. At its heart stood the temple of Artemis, a wonder of the world, its 100 gleaming columns stretching toward heaven, its steps worn smooth by the feet of pilgrims. To the world it was a sanctuary of divine peace, but for Arsinoe IV it was a beautiful prison. Under the protection of the goddess, no blood could be spilled within those sacred walls. Caesar had chosen her exile carefully. Here, far from Egypt and Rome, Arsinoe was safe but also silenced. She lived as a political ghost, neither queen nor slave, walking among priestesses who did not know that the quiet woman lighting the temple's lamps had once commanded armies and defied emperors. Every dawn, sunlight poured through the open roof, casting golden light on the marble floor. Arsinoe would kneel there, her face illuminated by a light that no longer felt divine. Around her, hymns to Artemis echoed, soft and reverent, yet beneath that harmony, her heart beat with rage and remembrance. The pilgrims who passed her saw only a serene priestess in white linen, her hair braided simply, her eyes lowered in humility. They could not see the golden scars on her wrists where Caesar's chains had once gleamed. They could not hear the whispers that haunted her at night, the clash of Alexandria's war, the screams of soldiers, her brother's body sinking beneath the Nile. Letters still reached her. carried by merchants and messengers who did not dare to linger. Each word from Egypt was a blade. Cleopatra now ruled beside her youngest brother, her power secured through charm and cunning. And still she spoke Arsinoe's name in Roman ears, calling her a threat, a symbol for rebellion, a rival who could never truly die. In the sanctuary, Arsinoe's silence became her resistance. She refused despair. She fed doves in the courtyard. She sang hymns. She smiled to pilgrims. But inside the fire smoldered. She was waiting, not for rescue, not for mercy, but for reckoning, because even in exile her existence was a danger to queens and conquerors alike. Every sunrise that found her alive was an insult to Cleopatra's throne. And so the marble halls of the temple whispered her story to the wind, a story of a woman stripped of her crown, yet still unbroken, a queen whose cage was made of light and prayer, but whose spirit refused to kneel. Time is merciless even to legends. Years passed, and the balance of empires shifted once more. Julius Caesar was dead, struck down by his own senators in a burst of steel and betrayal. Rome collapsed into chaos, tearing itself apart in a war of vengeance and ambition. But far from that turmoil, in the sacred calm of Ephesus, Arsinoe IV still lived, a ghost of a dynasty, a woman whose very breath defied the will of Rome and the wrath of her sister. She had made peace with silence, or so she thought. Each morning the temple bells called her to prayer beneath the marble columns of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Pilgrims still came, whispering prayers for fertility, wealth, or forgiveness. None of them knew that among the priestesses walked a fallen queen, a woman whose survival was itself a sin in Cleopatra's eyes. In 41 BCE, a new name came to her in hushed tones: Mark Antony. The Roman general had arrived in Ephesus with fleets, legions, and the vanity of a man who believed himself a god. Behind him, like a shadow carved in gold, came Cleopatra. The Queen of Egypt entered the city in a parade of silk, gold, and scent, her chariots gleaming, her slaves scattering rose petals at her feet. The people of Ephesus bowed in awe, unaware that they were watching the serpent return to strike. That night, beneath the glittering lanterns of Antony's palace, Cleopatra made her final, ruthless request. She whispered of Arsinoe, of the sister who had defied Rome and might yet rally Egypt's enemies. Her words dripped with honey, but each syllable was poison. Antony, drunk on her presence, agreed. He would give her this favor, and in doing so stain his name forever. The next morning the peace of the temple shattered. Roman soldiers stormed the sanctuary, torches flaring against the white marble. Priestesses screamed as they ran for cover. Arsinoe, hearing the chaos, fled to the altar of Artemis, the one place no mortal dared to defile. She clung to the statue, her voice rising in desperate prayer. But Antony's men did not stop. They dragged her down from the sacred steps, her white robe streaked with blood and dust. The blade fell swiftly. Her blood spread across the marble floor, a crimson river beneath the feet of the goddess. The murder was more than a killing. It was blasphemy, a crime that echoed through centuries. For on that day, the sacred ground of Ephesus was defiled, and the blood of a Ptolemaic princess became a curse on all who spilled it. The temple floor was scrubbed clean, but the blood never truly left. For years after the murder, the name Arsinoe IV was forbidden to be spoken in public. Cleopatra and Mark Antony moved swiftly to erase her from memory. Scribes were ordered to strike her name from royal records, her images defaced, her likeness chiseled from the walls of temples and tombs. Even the chroniclers of Rome, eager to please their new allies, wrote of her as nothing more than a rebellious girl. The victors had spoken, and history obeyed. Cleopatra once ruled over Egypt as a goddess, but her greatest power was not seduction, it was erasure. She rewrote truth as easily as one rewrites a scroll. In her Egypt, there was no Arsinoe IV, no teenage queen who had nearly destroyed Julius Caesar, no defiant sister who had bled upon sacred marble. What remained of Arsinoe was not a body, not a crown, but a whisper, a presence too stubborn to die. For centuries that whisper lingered in silence. The sands of Egypt buried her name. The marble streets of Ephesus forgot her footsteps. Yet time, like the tide, has a way of returning what is lost. In 1929, nearly 2,000 years after her death, a team of Austrian archaeologists digging near the ruins of the Temple of Artemis uncovered a mysterious octagonal tomb. It stood apart from the others, its geometric perfection unlike any known Greek or Roman design. Inside they found fragments of bone and a skull, delicate yet regal. The tomb's structure, Egyptian in style and adorned with faint carvings of lotus and papyrus, hinted at a royal hand. Whispers spread through the archaeological world. Had they found the lost queen? If the bones belonged to Arsinoe IV, it meant that someone, perhaps a priestess, perhaps a sympathizer, had defied Cleopatra's command to erase her. Someone had remembered. The tomb would be her final rebellion, a monument built in silence to resist oblivion itself. But the modern world is no kinder to ghosts. Forensic studies cast doubt. DNA tests and carbon dating yielded inconclusive results. Some scholars insisted the remains were not hers. Others argued that the evidence, the temple's proximity, the design, the timing, was too perfect to ignore. The truth remains elusive, and yet perhaps that is fitting. Arsinoe was never meant to rest quietly in history's archives. Her power lies not in certainty, but in remembrance, whether her bones sleep beneath the marble of Ephesus or not. Her story has already risen again, etched not in stone, but in every voice that dares to speak her name. Arsinoe IV, the sister who defied Rome, the queen erased by her own blood, and the woman history tried but failed to forget.